completely debunking the sermon. Oh, there we go. Wow. Sounds like God. Can you put a little more reverb on that for me, please? I'm going to debunk that in the sermon today, too. Oh, my. We got a ways to go here. So what I'm going to be doing here in the next few weeks is I'm going to be working on my sermons for an entire year. And I would like to set those up, not following the weekly readings that you're probably used to. We'll still do Christmas and Easter and Lent and all that sort of thing, Advent. But I'd like to develop my own set of sermon series, and so and my own topics, because I want to better respond to where this congregation is. So rather than just sort of taking them as they come, what I intend to do here in the next few weeks is to come up with about 104 or so sermon topics, and I'll divide those into sermon series, and that will be sort of the basis for the next year's worth of preaching. And so one of those is going to be a series, this is the only one I've really thought through so far, on questions and answers, what you'd like to know about the faith. So I don't know if I'm not going to call it Ask the Pastor, because I hate that. You'll see why in a few minutes. But let's call it questions and maybe since you asked or something like that. I don't know. But if you have questions about the faith, if there are things that are troubling you, things you don't understand, let's go ahead and write it down. I don't want your names on there. You can write anything you want. My hat size is probably not applicable, but everything else is in terms of the faith. And write it down, and I will call through those, and hopefully from that list we'll be able to come up with a sermon series for you. So that's just one of 104 sermons, or maybe 5 or 6 of 104 sermons that we will be doing. And by the way, 104, we have Wednesday night service, we have Sunday service, and the sermons are always different between the two. Sometimes they dovetail, so Wednesday night will be kind of a ramp up for Sunday, but always they're all separate and they're all different. Okay, so bear that in mind as you go through your week. If you come on Wednesday, you're not going to get a repeat on Sunday, and sometimes twice a week worship with the lives that we live isn't all bad. So with that, I was wondering, have I ever told you folks here? I know I've told a few of you. Have I ever told this story in church about my very first sermon? No. I've told a couple people. Evidently, I've not told this story. So if you've heard it, bear with me. If I've told it here before, you just bear with me. So it was my junior year in high school, and I was president of the Luther League at Morningside Lutheran in Sioux City, and we were doing an Easter sunrise youth service. We were going to do it outside. We got great weather that day. We set up folding chairs out on the lawn, and I was going to be the preacher. And I worked on this thing. It was only going to be about 5 or 6 minutes long. I worked on this thing feverishly, and because I wanted to do it without notes, kind of like I do here. I've got these, right? But this is a lamppost for a drunk, right? I just got to have something to hang on to. I wanted to do it kind of by memory or by heart or just to talk to them. And to this day, I am thankful that there were only 12 chairs set up, and only about 2/3 of the chairs were full. I stood up to do my sermon, and I just went, thump, just blank. I had no idea what I was going to say. It was whatever was on the paper that was sitting in the chair, the folding chair that I had just gotten out of, was completely gone from my mind. And I stood there and looked at them, and they stood there and looked at me. And I stood there and looked at them. And they stood there and looked at me. And I'm sure it was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. But it felt like an eternity. And finally, I said, I have no idea what I was going to say. And I sat down. Absolutely true story. Absolutely true story. Well, I have to tell you that I felt that same way last Sunday with my sermon. Because I got up here, I stood up, I had, it was going to be a sermon about, and it ended up kind of being that, about the way that God uses the words that we speak here, no matter what they are, and it's not about the person, it's about the words that are spoken. And I got up here and just went blank. And I don't know, did anybody notice that there were like long, pregnant pauses that were maybe not necessarily for dramatic effect? Well, that's what was happening. And I went back afterwards and shook hands, and people said, well, thank you very much. That was such a good sermon, Pastor. Some folks said that. Some folks kind of rolled their eyes and said, well, I won't be back for this guy again. And some of them were just being nice, I'm sure. But anyway, so finally, after all that, I went over to Dave Van Devender and said, Dave, I told him what happened. I said, I just don't know what happened here. And he said, you know what you just told us in the sermon? It's not about you, preacher. And so the preacher got a sermon on Sunday. And I thank you very much because, that's kind of freeing to think that it's not about me, that I could just completely screw up in reverse and God finds a way to use that anyway. That's a cool thing. So today I want to sort of talk about the other side of the coin, so other side of the same coin. And to get at that, I've got 2 or 3 stories, very short stories, but they're all very true. The first was when I was dating my wife, Jill, and we went to her home for the very first time. And then she wanted to introduce me not only to her family, but also to her grandparents, who lived down in Badger. And so we drove down to Badger and had a lovely time. Jill's grandfather, his name was Arnie Hansen, grew up in Norway, and he took me around and showed me all the paintings of Norway, the places that he knew. And we had a little bit of lunch, and then it was time to play cards. We were going to play 500. And the strangest thing happened. Arnie got up and went around the house and pulled all the shades. Some of you know what's happening. And I thought it was just the most curious thing. And so afterwards, I asked her, why did he do that? And she said, in this town, you don't play cards. That's kind of against the faith. And he said, some people will tell you, well, you know what those jacks mean? And I say, yeah, 2 and 3 supporting is like a 7-bid, right? But no, they mean something. And so you pull the shades because you don't want one of the deacons to see you, or worse yet, to have the pastor see you playing cards in this community. And of course, it also occurs to me that the pastor is probably not driving by and peeking in the house. He's probably a block and a half down in his own parsonage, pulling his own shades and pulling out his own deck of cards. More than likely, that's what happens. So that's story number 1. Story number 2, and this has happened in every parish since my very first parish. On Monday morning, I get a phone call from a young parent. And they tell me this story about their child. And the child said, I talked to God yesterday. And parents said, well, tell me more. And the child, word for word, recited the children's sermon from that day. You know where this is going too, don't you? And the parents said, what do you mean you talked to God? He said, well, God, that guy with the funny robe up front. Pressure's on, right? Third story. A few weeks ago, a friend of mine and I had a conversation, and she said to me, Pastor, I wish that I could be more like you. And I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, well, when you preach, you're just so confident. And it's like you've got your life all together, and you know for certain about this faith. And I wish I had that in my life. And I think there's this perception out there. I know there's this perception out there that we've been fostering, that I've been fostering, that pastors foster, that congregations foster, that the pastor's sort of above the fray of normal life. And in a certain respect, so is the parish. That you and I, we've got it all together. And when I preach, just because I stand up here and do this on a weekly basis, I've got this certainty that no one else has. And because you come in here each week and you hear these lessons, you have that same certainty that no one else has. And that's so messed up because it's so far from the truth. You can't even imagine how far from the truth it is. I'm not going to go into detail how far from the truth that is in my personal life, but just take my word for it. I'm not there. But that's the perception. And you know, it's no wonder that so many people feel so uncomfortable coming into a place like First Lutheran Church. Because, I mean, first of all, they walk in here, and we've talked about this before, and I say, the Lord be with you, and you say, yeah, you know, you can do it in your sleep. You know, it's just reflexive, right? But the person, and for you, that's the language of your heart. For someone who walks in for the very first time, it's, how am I supposed to know that? And then the preacher stands up here. I stand up here, and by the way, this is why I don't wear robes anymore, because there's enough of this going on without me dressing up and further distancing myself from you and from whoever else walks in here. It's so important that we get that out of our heads. And the preacher stands up, and I give a message of confidence and of certainty, and I have all the teachings lined up. I can quote the Bible, and I do regularly, as you know. And the teachings are all correct. And most of all, it just sort of helps people sort things out. And folks come in here and they just feel like, I don't have that. I don't belong in this place. This guy's got it all together, and my life's all messed up. These people have it all together, and my life just doesn't make that kind of sense. And I think we battle that all the time here. I wish that we could shed ourselves of that, because I believe there's a better way. I think the perception is that church is an answer place, and that church is about certainty, and that the church, and it is an answer place, don't get me wrong, but not an answer place like, you give me the question, I'll give you the right answer, boom, there you go, and that's it for good. I believe the church is an answer place, but not in that way where it's so certain. I think people have that perception. But I'd like you to think about the church and the pastor not as the answer guy and the answer place, but as the place where messed up people are loved by Jesus. And the first person who's most messed up is the guy who's standing before you right now. Let's sing. So when I thought about this and what I would say to you, I thought about this lesson I just read to you, and it's the story about Paul and the church that he created in a place called Corinth. It's in Greece. And Paul got this church started, and then later on wrote to this church. He wrote 2 letters that we are familiar with, 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. And basically all this is just the pastor who's away writing to his congregation, and they're experiencing some kind of trouble. And we're not going to get into all the troubles right now, but at least not all of them. But in Corinth at the time, there were, at this church, there were at least 3 and maybe 4 different people who rose up as leadership. And one of them was obviously Paul, because he started the church. But then there was another guy by the name of Cephas, and another guy by the name of Apollos. And then there's this third guy, we don't quite know who he is, but he had aligned himself with the Christ faction in the church. And all of these factions in the church, all of these groups in the church, and they were factions. They weren't just groups. They were against each other. They had the certain right answers that everyone else had to have. And there was a certainty to all of that. And those leaders were pristine, and they came in boldly to proclaim whatever it was that they were proclaiming as truth. And Paul hears about this, and of course one of these groups, these factions, is named after him. And so he writes to them and he says, it's not what we're about. He said, I came to you, and I decided to come to you as one who knew nothing except Christ and him crucified. Now let's go back a little bit first, because of all of these people, I know nothing about these other leaders, but I do know something about Paul. If anyone had something to boast about, it was Paul. He knew his Bible inside and out. He was a religious leader at a very young age, and he had far surpassed everyone else who was decades older than he was, because he was so good at it. He had all the answers. He lived according to the ways of his religion, and he did so without flaw. He had all of those things lined up. So if anybody had something to brag about, it was Paul. But he comes into this congregation and he reminds them, he says, remember, when I came here, I decided to know nothing about anything except Jesus Christ and him crucified. Truth be known, that may have been Paul's approach, but that was not Paul's decision. It was God who knocked Paul down. Because before he met Jesus Christ, there was something else on Paul's resume. He was certain. He had all of these gifts lined up. He had all of this knowledge lined up, and he knew the right answer. So much so that he had decided for himself that this upstart group in the Jewish faith called Christianity was an aberration, and they needed to go. They were polluting the faith. And so Paul, who was certain that he was on the right track, he was positive he was doing exactly what God wanted him to do, started persecuting Christians, throwing them in jail. It was God who knocked him down. So he took him from certainty to breadcrumbs. First of all, he's on his way to Damascus to round up Christians and throw them in jail. On the way to Damascus, Jesus hits Paul with a blinding light, and his eyes are quite literally blinded. Breadcrumb. Not certainty, breadcrumb. For 3 days, Paul remains blind. This is before Corinth. For 3 days, Paul remains blind. Breadcrumb. He has sent to him a guy by the name of Ananias, who's afraid to talk to Paul because Paul's rounding Christians up. God says, talk about breadcrumbs. Ananias had a breadcrumb there too. God said to Ananias, you go. I'm sending you. And Ananias went up and went to Paul. And he healed Paul. And it was like the scales fell off of Paul's eyes and he could see again. Breadcrumb. Paul went into seclusion for a period of years. Breadcrumb. You see where this is going? This is not a man who lives by certainty anymore. He did it one time, but he doesn't now. Instead, he lives day by day with struggles and trials and temptations. He lives day by day, not knowing if he was going to be thrown in prison or killed for what he believed. And at every turn, and by the way, he lived day by day with some kind of sin or ailment. He had a thorn in the flesh. And God didn't just fix that for him with some kind of brilliant revelation. God just put another breadcrumb in front of him. just like that, all through life. He walked with Paul and showed him the way, not with grand visions, not with great knowledge, but with day by day a breadcrumb of grace, a breadcrumb of forgiveness, a breadcrumb of direction, all the way through Paul's life. Now, I think it's a good thing to know your scriptures, not because you can show off and show everybody that you know your stuff, but because God gives you breadcrumbs through those things. But you can know all the scriptures in the world, but if you think you're right, it doesn't do you a bit of good. And so Paul comes to Corinth deciding that he's not going to come in here like everyone else has come in here with all the right answers. He's going to walk with them like Jesus walked with him. I know nothing except Christ and him crucified. In other words, I know nothing except a God who loves me so much that he gives his life. And I don't know where this is going, and I don't know where it's leading, but I have to trust that God is going to take me and lead me through all of life's ways. And that's what Paul lived, and that's what Paul preached. He didn't stand up in a high pulpit. He was down on the floor with his own people, walking daily with them, with their struggles, with their trials, looking for the breadcrumbs of God. I think back to my own life. Not a lot of blinding revelations there, my friends, but a whole lot of breadcrumbs. And I got that early on. From my youngest days, I lived within 3 blocks of the 2 parsonages for Morningside Lutheran, which meant that I was friends with all the PKs. And which also meant that I ate lunch with all the PKs at their homes. And I played in their yards, and they played in my yards. And then I would listen, and I would hear Palmer Wold and Don Sarf stand up on a Sunday morning, and they would make these bold declarations. But I had a front row seat to what was behind the scenes. And their families were just like mine. A little messy, not always going exactly as it should, just like mine, just like yours. And I would hear this on Sunday morning, and I had that context that really no one else had. And it made me want to know more. Not because of certainty, but because here were people who were walking in the faith just like me. I think about that. I think about my early college years when I stopped going to church altogether. And God just kept putting the breadcrumbs in front of me. I think about the way he put that amazing breadcrumb named Jill in my life. He did that through a friend of mine, another pastor, a guy by the name of Jim Carpenter. Oh, Jim, there was a real guy. There was a real guy. And he talked about the faith incessantly, and he showed me who he was. He was not afraid to be the sinful person he was and to live in the grace of God and to be guided day by day. And God put Jill there, another breadcrumb. And God put seminary there, another breadcrumb. And all my teachers there who were also, guess what? Sinful people just looking for their way, following breadcrumbs. And my parishes. A year ago, he put Peterson in front of me, another breadcrumb. And goodness knows, it's the only reason I'm here. It isn't Dan that's the reason I'm here. It's that God kept putting these breadcrumbs out. I was comfortable where I was. What in the world am I doing? 61-year-old guy moving to a new congregation. I should be thinking about retirement. God keeps putting the breadcrumbs out. And all I can do is just keep following them. Not because I have the right answers, but because it's a better way to live. It's a better way to live our lives. And not because I'm perfect, but because I'm sinful. I'm unclean. I don't understand anything about myself really in the long run. I don't understand why my relationships are sometimes messy. And I keep coming back here, and I keep looking for those crumbs. I keep diving into the scriptures, and I keep looking for those crumbs. And you know, when I preach on Sunday morning, you guys are hearing it. But I'll tell you, I'm kind of selfish. I'm preaching it for me. Because the things that I say, I need to hear. And you know, if we can think of ourselves in that way, how much better off we would be. Not a grand leader standing in front of a congregation of certain people, but just a bunch of regular folks trying to find their way through life. Let's sing. So, and you can already see where this is going. I think I'd like you to think about church in a different way. It's not a headquarters in Chicago with a big organization. It's not a building. It's not a bunch of preachers and a bunch of parishioners who come to share their certainties. This is the church right here, and it could happen in a building like this, or it could happen in a coffee shop across town. Or it can happen in a classroom or beside your locker with a friend. Because in the end, what church is it's people who share two things. They share the fact that they are just people who are hurting, lost, and alone. And they share a desire to find their way through life together. So let's do life together. Let's look for breadcrumbs, the ones that God dropped. And who knows where that will take us. And to those of you who might be here for the very first time, maybe took the plunge and decided to darken the door of a church for the first time in years, or maybe the first time ever, I just want to ask you, that sounds so bad? We're all the same. We're all just looking to find our way. All of us with, as it used to say in the old book, secret thoughts and desires that I cannot fully understand, but are all known unto thee, God. We all have those things in our life. And we're just looking to find our way. Why not join us? There's a whole raft of people here who are just looking to find their way. And to those of you who are here every week, I also have a question for you. Is there space in these pews for more? And are there people that you know who are lost and alone, but no one has found a way to reach out and touch them? Bring them here. Not because we want to fill the pews or make it look successful, but because a simple invitation might change their lives. They can find their way as well. And your life also. We can do this together. Amen.